I'm going to tell you how I got involved in and aware of the threats to parental rights, the forces that are working against them in education. I'd like to kind of discuss, and specifically, attendance issues. I don't know if you are aware of anything going on with this, but across the nation, there is a push to basically criminalize non-attendance at school. Not truancy, which is skipping school and being there without your, being gone without parents' permission, but actually not being in your seat when school's in session. They call it absenteeism. And I want to tell you guys about what elements are at play with this, what threats it presents to our rights, and make you familiar with some of the key terms, the buzzwords, and the distinctions you want to be aware of as you talk to your legislators, hear about legislation coming up and such. So I'm going to give you some background of how I came to this and the vivid experience I had that made this something that's very important to me. I was living in Nebraska in 2010. As my little bio mentioned, I had spent years working with a grassroots group advocating for family choice and rights in the area of childbirth and midwives. Well, my friend had gone to a local school board meeting, and she'd come back and she told me that they had discussed this bill that had something to do with attendance. They passed it in 2010, I guess this was early 2011, and they were looking at a revision in 2011, and both of us had this little radar going off, that doesn't feel right, let's look at that thing. So we went and looked at it together. Her father's a very accomplished attorney, has actually been in the state government here, so she was familiar with some of the ins and outs of that, and I, of course, had been dealing with this in a different arena for a while. Well, we looked this up and we realized that in 2010, they had passed a bill that automatically sent all students who had missed 20 days of school to the county attorney. And you think, well, 20 days of school is a lot. Of course they should be investigated. Well, most, of course you and I know there are good reasons to miss school, bad reasons to miss school, but really what it boiled down to was they were eliminating a parent's right to excuse their child from school. And we looked at it and said, that can't be going well. When I saw the news about this, they'd said they're going to reduce truancy. Well, I'm all about reducing truancy. If you can get kids who are skipping school motivated to be back in school, this is a good thing, right? So I didn't even pay attention to these headlines I saw coming across on my newspaper in 2010. And then when I realized what the actual bill was and the way the media had sold it was not what it was, I was concerned. So my friend and I went and started talking to some legislators about the revisions that we were seeing. We started talking to people, and stories started coming out of the woodwork of what had happened just in the course of 1 year since this bill had been passed. And what was happening was you had mostly, really by and large, chronically sick kids who of course miss a lot of school, right? Because they're chronically ill, being sent to the county attorney. And I'll share some of the stories in a minute, but this really started concerning us. So we started to collect these stories. We then organized several of the people to go up to the legislature and testify at the hearings. And it's always exciting for me to bring people who've never been to the legislature before to sit and feel like they have a voice. That was an exciting process. And we basically made the legislators aware that, hey, there are a lot of parents who weren't consulted on this and were concerned about where this is going. Because as we watched the hearings unfold, what we saw were social services, advocates, various education entities from the districts or various more education establishment entities, and we saw, of course, law enforcement people from various county attorneys from various counties. And we thought, okay, where are the parents in this? And anybody talked to them? So we started a conversation with the bill sponsor, and he became aware that we were concerned, but everybody thought, but this is a good thing. We're going to help kids. And the newspapers were publishing stories about the kids who this new law was helping, because automatically, if you've missed 20 days, the county attorney gets to evaluate whether or not you really should have missed those 20 days. It's basically saying, I get to scrutinize your choices as a parent and tell you whether you really should have excused your child for those 20 days. Well, the stories that we were seeing were, I'll give you a few examples. A girl who was an honor roll student, 8th grade, a great student, involved in student government, involved in, I think it was band, just very active student, but she had chronic seasonal asthma. So in the fall, she got really bad asthma, and she'd be home for a lot of days. Well, this kicked her into under this new law, kicked her into the county attorney's office. In the county where she was, Lancaster County, where the capital of Lincoln is located, they put her into what was called a diversion program. So they all have to go before the judge, and the judge decides what's going to happen to each of these kids. They said, well, you need a diversion program. Her mother was very frustrated by this, because in the diversion program, she was put with a lot of young people who didn't have her values, I mean, kids who had actually been skipping, right? And she got put in with this group of kids that were not positive influences, and she was being required to attend this. Well, as the diversion program wrapped up, as a side note, who runs the diversion program and who gets money for it, right? That's a big thing that's hanging there over this whole thing that's going on across the country. So somebody's running the diversion program and somebody's getting paid for it. At the end, the judge looked at her records, okay, you've completed your program, but I want you to do this summer program to build bonds with the kids you've been with and strengthen your resolve to go to school. Again, her mom's like, I thought I had a diversion program, not a summer program, but they bring these kids in, these families who would never have anything to do with law, ever, and this automatic 20 days was sucking them into the system. And of course, anytime you're dealing with children, there's this fear that your child could be taken away from you by this government. And that's really the fear that hangs over the head of all these parents in the case of Nebraska and in many other states where this kind of thing with different dynamics is going on, is if I don't obey the judge's orders, what happens? There was another girl who was also an honor roll student, good kid, who ended up with just a horrible medical year. She had meningitis, which of course is very serious. She recovered from that, was good, but then she ended up with mono, and so of course hit the 20-day. Her mother showed up. We didn't know anything about her. She showed up to the legislative hearing for this revision along with us. That's where we met her, and she was just so frustrated and so upset that they had taken her daughter, who had just gotten sick as could be, and adding to all that stress and pressure of being so ill, she has to go and report and account for her parents' decisions, or the parents have to account for their decisions to the county attorney. And the injustice was so keenly felt, especially in these families with good kids who are like, there's no reason we should be talking to law enforcement or be tied up in this. There was another young girl who was about 5th grade who was bullied at school, really bullied. She had some physical problems which made her skeletal frame a little bit deformed, and her face not as attractive as many, but also a good kid, but bullied. Her mother had communicated with the school about it and was very concerned, and when her daughter was walking home from school about 3 weeks before the end of school, some kids jumped out of the bushes and beat her with a stick. And she said, you know what? This is it. I can't put my daughter in this risky situation. I'm going to homeschool her for the last 3-4 weeks of school, and then we'll start again next year, hopefully a little better situation. Well, when they started school again next year, she filed all the paperwork and everything she needed to do, but when they started school again next year, she was served notice that she had to show up at the county attorney for the day she'd missed previous. And of course the legislation was written in such a way that you didn't know whether the 20 days had to happen within a school year or within a calendar year, and they were using that to their advantage. And so another case, bullying, really tough, and you pile on that the state scrutinizing the decisions of parents. So you can kind of see the picture that's growing. You had another family where there had been a couple of deaths in the family and they were out of state, so they traveled around, and they had a kindergartner. A kindergartner who misses 20 days of school. What harm is that when you've got a good, loving family that's going to do all right? So that kind of gives you a taste of what was coming at us as we started to look at this, and we understood the implications of treating absenteeism the same as truancy. So we basically broke it down and said, well, what's going on here? What's going on? So I started doing some investigating. My friends started doing some investigating. As we looked out across the broad landscape, we started to see these studies that were being done by various universities, other entities, often groups would sponsor them, groups that were specifically focused on attendance. One is called Attendance Works. They've gotten their fingers in Utah and are pushing on the districts here. There are a number of other groups pushing for better attendance. And as I talk about this, I want you to understand that trying to help young people who don't attend often because of low motivation is a good thing. I think that's a great thing. If you've got kids who are missing a lot of school for any number of reasons that they just need a friendly hand to reach out, a mentor, a better program that engages them, I think that's positive. But we're looking at people who say attendance is a priority. There should be nothing higher in a child's life than attendance in school. And so we're pushing back against that, saying, no, there are a lot of things in life that are more important than attendance at school, and we've got to make sure that parents are the protectors and the decision makers. Will sometimes decisions be made that I might not agree with? Of course. But if I want to be able to make decisions for my children, I'd better let somebody else make decisions that I'm like, I wouldn't do that, but hey, you know, it's your family. And we've got to respect that and protect that law. What we find is that attendance works. So 2012 here in Utah, they tried to pass a bill that would have made reporting attendance one of the, I think it was an AYP measure back in the old days when you had annual yearly progress. You had to report on your attendance rates. And this is where you break down by percentage versus number of students. You can have a certain number of students or a good daily percentage. So say you have 96% attendance every day in your school, it could be, that's great. Those who are looking at it are saying, well, but if you go in and look at that, 20% of those kids are missing 18 days or more, and that's a problem. And what we're saying is not necessarily. Often those are really good students. In fact, I would wager that if you bothered to go in and do a study of really high achieving students, you would find they miss more school than the average kid because they're engaged and involved in all sorts of things outside of school, and their parents are getting them out to, make sure school doesn't get in the way of their education, and very often they miss quite a bit of school. But what the studies are doing is they're conflating truancy and absenteeism. They're treating excused absences and unexcused absences as if they're the same thing. And in doing that, they're taking away a parent's ability to excuse their child. Because, for example, in Nebraska, these parents were getting so worried that their child would have a real sick episode, like a bad flu for a week or something like that, that when the child would have a slight stomach bug or a cold, they'd send them to school anyway. So you had, and of course it was the middle class, aware parents, knowing stories of what was happening to their friends, that were doing this and sending kids to school sick and all these things that you would never recommend, all in the name of improving attendance. Why do we want to improve attendance? Well, because studies show that a better attendance means better test scores. Well, you have to break that down and you'll see that by socioeconomic group it's very different, but that's all complicated and required graphs that I didn't put together. The real key is excused versus unexcused. And when they take these studies and they lump excused and unexcused together, it makes the kids whose absences are excused look like they're a problem. Because when you were pushed in with a group of kids with unexcused absences who are skipping school, right? Of course the average is going to go down and it's going to look bad. But when I found 3 studies that broke out excused versus unexcused, 3 out of several dozen, I think. And when they break it apart, being excused from school with a lot of absences does not really affect a grade or test scores. Why? Because the parents are involved. We're making sure the child's there, doing their homework while they're gone, catching up, etc. So the things to be aware of are that those who are pushing a focus on attendance really do have a strong collectivist mentality. If we can allow the government to scrutinize a parent's choices for why they're excusing their children, then we can make sure that children don't miss for the wrong reason and they can do well in school and they'll want to be in school. Of course, really what we're looking at is a root problem. Why aren't they motivated to be there? And putting a child in a seat does not change their attitude towards school. And those who are interested in changing it, I'd reach out to and say, you got to change the environment of school that makes them happier to be there. But with the attendance issue, as we see legislation come through, need to be aware of this term absenteeism, which does not distinguish between excused and unexcused, and of any effort to bring law enforcement or government scrutiny to or to limit the ability of parents to excuse their children from school. So for example, Alpine School District has a really good excuse policy. It's excellent. It has a list of about 5 different things and then says, or for any reason the parent deems worthwhile, or the what have you. You'll see in practice that it doesn't always work because they've got some things going on like attendance school at Lone Peak High School, and this is if you miss more than 4 days in a class, you have to attend attendance school, even if you missed for being sick or because you had an orthodontist appointment or because you had anything else. So little things like this are creeping in. After this bill in 2012, we tried to pass, you wonderful Eagle Forum people, thanks to my recent acquaintanceship with Gail. I was like, if I read this article, can you link to it? So she got it all out to Eagle Forum and various other advocates, and the legislators heard, we don't like this, and even though a number of illustrious groups were there to give the graphs and the pretty pictures and show why this was going to be an awesome thing, the legislators realized that people weren't comfortable with it, so it didn't pass. The next year, however, Attendance Works, this national group that's pushing for draconian attendance policies, came in and held a big attendance day up at the Capitol, or I think it was at probably Grand America or somewhere really posh. And they told people why it was so important that we focus more on increasing attendance, reducing absence. And they basically started going into the districts. I think they're targeting districts and trying to get at the district level the districts to clamp down on attendance and be more draconian and less respectful of family decisions. And one of the things that's driving this is, keep in mind that now with the federal regulations that are being pushed to hold teachers accountable for their students' performance, which we all know is outrageous because it's parents who are accountable for their students' performance. These teachers feel like, well, if they're not in the seat, how can I teach them? How can I be held accountable for this, right? So they're in this tight spot where it's not like they want to put pressure on the families of the children they teach. But at the same time, their job and their pay might be tied to whether this child does well, and they're not sure they can because they have their seat. So it's a really messy thing. So to keep it clear, we have to say no matter what other factors are involved, we cannot take away the rights of parents to excuse their child for any reason that they feel is fit. And so I hope that explains some of the threats that are coming through this attendance approach. And later, after Allison has her word, I'd love to answer questions about it, things I've seen, or suggestions or ideas.
Can I keep you here for a second? Yeah. Before she sits down, I wondered, Autumn, if you would mention the financial motivations in Nebraska.
All right. So I kind of mentioned a little bit, but you had these diversion programs where the social services would then be paid to put these kids in diversion programs. And because you were bringing in all this, imagine a juvenile court judge sitting with their room full of kids who have been mandated to come in, and you've got these groups of families, and they call up the kid and their parents one by one and say, do you have medical records to prove to me that their child was really sick? Do you have this? And they scrutinize them in front of the whole room, which, HIPAA, is that going to work? But basically you've got all these kids, and so they bring them in and they cull this group and they say, all right, you guys are now going to be part of this diversion, part of these social services. And of course, the social services, it was like a racket for them. All these new people they never would have had in their system because they were good families, doing what was good, living their lives the best they could, and so there was a financial motivation in there to keep the money flowing, and some of it we still haven't been able to nail down, but especially in that Lancaster County where the capital is, it was pretty insidious and is still going on to a certain extent. Oh, and I meant to mention, in 2014, they actually did pass finally the bill that repealed it. We kept the stories after I moved in 2011, was still pretty active for about a year after that, and my friends, kept it running, and they kept the stories coming to the legislators, they kept the people coming to the legislature, and finally they realized, what, this really is creating more of a disaster than being a help, and so they repealed the law in 2014.